Hey everyone, and welcome. Alteryx Server is powerful software to automate workflows to run jobs at scale, right? But as a consultant, I'm frequently asked about how to orchestrate when it comes to multiple workflows. Chain them together in a predictable, repeatable process. And honestly, that's not necessarily that straightforward in Server sometimes. There are older solutions, if you've been around Alteryx for some time, on how to accomplish this with using crew macros. So crew macros have been around for some time, and they will actually do the job to let you coordinate the steps between workflows. But the problem is that when it comes to server itself, these macros are not supported, and in fact they won't work. And the reason for that is that under the hood they're actually using a command line execution to run that workflow and not the gallery. And so you don't get things like logs, and it won't show up in fact, the job results won't even show up in server, even if you could run it. So other customers have had some success or had lots of success with chained apps. Chained apps are another method and it can work. However, I find that that's harder to maintain. It's oftentimes tougher to debug when things go wrong, and it's not that easy to pass it on to other users who might not be familiar with the whole process and have to kind of reverse engineer and figure out how those work. So I've got a solution, and I'm going to walk through that today. We're going to break this down. I'm also going to make this available to even use in your environment and to kind of see how this workflow works. I really like this workflow a lot, and I use this with customers because it actually illustrates some good concepts around macros in Alteryx. And I'm going to walk through some of that as we go through this, and talk about how those are actually controlling the process and really kind of setting that orchestration pipeline for us. So first of all, let's take a high level look at what we've got here. So this is in the middle. This is a macro. I built this. We're going to take a look at that in just a second. But as you can see, this is a pretty simple process. Um, what I'm going to basically give this macro is a list of workflows. So let's take a look at that real quick. Over on the left side here, you can see I've got a text input, and on the top here, really, I'm just putting in the workflow ID, and that's kind of the critical part. I'm going to show you that on gallery. As a quick, cool side note, because we're using the APIs here, if the workflow is in fact an app and it's expecting user input, let's say, so you have a report, you've got to put in the dates that you want to run those reports, we can actually pass those values in here to automate that entirely. So we can complete that as well. So the workflow ID. So first question is, why are we using this? So the easiest kind of answer here is because these never change in gallery. This is a unique ID. We could put in name here, but that opens up the door to fat fingering it or potentially even having duplicate workflows in the gallery with the same name. So this is deterministic. Let's go find it. If we go into server and I click on a workflow, so I'm actually already in a workflow, but let me back up a step. And I can look at my workflows here. So let me just click on one of them. In the newer versions of Alteryx Server, the workflow ID is actually right here on the right side. And so I can just copy this value and put that right in our workflow ID column right here, and that's going to schedule this job. The workflow is on older versions, and a kind of a cool little tip for Alteryx is that the workflow ID is also in the URL on top, so we can find it right there as well. All right, so at that point, I now have the workflows that I want to run. Um, and so once I go ahead and run that, our macro is going to do its thing. We're going to take a look at that. I'm going to open it in a second, but we're going to see the results. And so this is, simplistic output, but very helpful because we can see that the workflows all did execute. Um, and we will actually even get the result status in here as well. So we can kind of see the output of that workflow, and that's super helpful, right? So this would be pretty easy to kind of pipe this into a notification or some kind of output where we can see that result. And so let's go take a look at the workflow. Let's go ahead and open this up here. And I'm just going to open them up side by side because I find with macros that's oftentimes a little bit easier to see. Okay, so first thing you're going to notice, we opened up the macro. It's actually a fairly simple macro. We only actually have a couple of tools in here that's going to be used. The first one is also it's a server API tool. This is a free tool you can download off of Marketplace or even get it in the add-ons here. So let me pull this up real quick and show the server usage report. Server API tool is right here. So you can actually just go ahead and click on install if you don't have that. And so this is going to kick everything off for us. So this first tool is going to interact with the Alteryx API endpoint to start the job. So effectively sending the command to server to say, hey, here's the workflow ID, go ahead and run it. And as a quick little side check, we can actually go take a look at the API endpoints that we're going to use too, so we can find our API endpoints. That's going to be here under help, API documentation. That then opens up a new window where we're going to see our Swagger documentation. And in here is all of the API endpoints and really the functionality that we can do with the server API. And so we'll kind of take a quick look here. So the first one is that we can see on the left side over here, we've got this selected. This is going to be our V1 workflows app ID jobs. And so this is effectively going to start a job. We're going to pass in the app ID. This then starts the job for, and this is important, only workflow number 1. And so the result of this is going to come into, and actually I kind of skipped over. Let's go to our workflow 1. So V1 is going to be the version 1, which is right here. And then we can open up the workflow section. And sure enough, we're going to see this right here. Post, just to kind of give some details. Post method is the REST API standards. So in this case, you can see that there's different. We're not actually getting information. Post will actually send a command, and it actually tells the computer to do something. In this case, you can see right here, we're going to queue a job execution for the specified workflow with the supplied answers. So in this case, you can see if we did have an analytic app that was expecting inputs, we would actually be able to pass those in right here. And then the result of this, the result that comes out of this first step is job ID. And it's probably not easiest to see here, but the workflow itself. So once this job is started, the kind of critical part of information that we need as a next step is the job ID. And that job ID did not exist until that job started. And so the continuation and really the control of this process comes down to that job ID. Because once we start the job, we're going to get the job ID. That's going to then come into our select tool. We're going to see and name that job ID right here. And then that job ID is going to go into our critical next step. So let's talk about that next step for just a second, because this is really sort of the crux of controlling the sequential nature of running workflows, is that, as you can see here, starting the workflow is easy. That's a single tool. We could do that very easy. The harder part is, how do we know when that job has stopped or completed, in fact? And so to accomplish that, what we're going to do is we're going to do another macro. So let me open this one up. And this macro is also quite simple. I'll show you. So this is just, you can see these containers as really handling the output, if you will. But the main lift comes down to this API call right here. And so this API call is going to get job status. And we can actually go take a quick look here. Let's go back to our V3. So we can see that's a V3 endpoint. And we're going to go to jobs, and we're going to see job ID, this one. So details about an existing job and its current state. And so that's the information, that's kind of the critical piece of information that we need to say, is the job still running or not? And so this endpoint is going to return the important information to us that says, what is the current state of that job? And so once we get the job status, the result of that is the important information that we really need to know. And that's the criteria that's going to tell us if the job is done, yes or no. And we're going to see that right here in our filter tool. And we can see if the status equals completed. And that tells the job, okay, hey, this workflow has done, has completed, and we can proceed and start the second job flow or workflow or subsequent workflow. So pretty easy in structure. So let's kind of talk about the mechanics. Like how did we get to here? How does this work? So let me zoom out on I'm going to go back to our main macro here. So if you follow the process, essentially what's happening is we start the job. The job ID comes out here, and we're going to feed that into this macro. Now, these two macros are different, and this is why I think this is a great illustration and way to understand macros in Alteryx. And macros are like power tools. They're very powerful to do, to extend what you can do by a wide margin. In this case, we've got two different types of macros. This macro itself, right here, is a batch macro. Inside of this batch macro is this orange one, and this orange one is an iterative macro. And so, okay, well, like how do I understand the difference between the two? And so the difference comes down to both of these loop and they iterate and they'll run more than one time or one or more times. And so the question becomes, how does the macro know when to stop? How does it know when it's done? And that's where the difference lies. So in a batch macro, it's fairly simple because we're going to feed it a batch. And our batch in this case is our list. We're going to feed it a list of 3 items. That list is going to come in here as soon as it's processed all 3 items. This batch macro is going to be done, and it'll complete. Inside of this batch macro, though, we've got this iterative macro. And the iterative macro is different because the way that it knows when to stop or when that macro should be done and exit is it's based on criteria. And so that criteria can be very flexible. In this case, it's simple because that criteria is status equals completed. And so with this criteria, this gives us the ability to determine what happens in this iterative macro. And so if I move over here just a little bit, you can see this iterative macro is more than likely going to run a number of times, especially if you've got a long running workflow, right? This iterative macro is just going to keep checking, and it's going to say, are you done? Are you done yet? Are you done? And each time that answer comes back as not equal to completed, we want it to continue, right? We want it to keep checking until it does actually see that it's completed. And so if the result comes back as a non-match, right? So anything, if it comes back as completed, we'll say exit. But if it's not completed, right, we want to iterate. And so this is the difference from an iterative macro right here, is that this is how it knows when to stop or how many loops this will run or not, which is very helpful when we don't know how many, like in this case, we don't know how long the workflow could take. The iterative macros are very helpful for things like we don't know how many files need to be downloaded, right? We're just going to download until there's no more files. So very powerful, important pieces to know. So in structure, and again, I think this is a great example to really get familiar with macros because they're very simple in what's happening. So let's go back out. So once our iterative macro gets the answer that it's looking for and it sees a status equals completed, that then is going to exit our iterative macro And at that point, we exit our batch macro. And so the batch macro, and remember, that only processes one record at a time in our input file. And so this first row one is going to process. Once we get that completed from the macro here, that will then uh, exit back to the macro to start record two. Ultimately, that completes our process and it controls everything in between so that we can clearly orchestrate and enforce, if you will, that the workflow execution happens in order. So awesome. Hopefully you learned something today. I'm going to post this for people to use at their own will. Let me know if anybody has any questions. Have a good day.